Thank you for watching another video. This video is going to be on Augustine and Manichaeism, Augustine and the Manichees. I'm going to be explaining Augustine's history with the Manichees, talking just real briefly about his 9 years as a Manichee, and focusing more exclusively. The video is going to focus on what Manichaeism taught and how Augustine responded to it and refuted it in his early writings. So in his confession, I'll first focus on Augustine as a Manichee, just mentioning a couple of brief things. In his confessions, Augustine wrote the confessions in about 404 or 405 is when he published it. The work was really, really popular. He had become a bishop, and because of rumors and talk about his past as a Manichee, he wanted to write the confessions in order to set the account straight of his history with Manichaeism, and also his conversion, how he became Catholic. So that's what prompted the confessions. And in the confessions, he talks about he spent 9 years as a Manichee, as a hearer. So he knew Manichaeism from the inside. It was something that he understood extremely well. And he had been what's called a hearer of the Manichees. They were divided into two groups, the elect and then the hearers. And the elect were the religious of the Manichees, and the hearers were like the laity. So this is, an analogy for that distinction. In the hearers, the elect had a prominent role. They also had bishops, like the early Catholic Church. They had bishops as well. And Augustine, again, he was a hearer for 9 years during some of his time in Rome. And he talks about this again in the Confessions, in narrating his story out of Manichaeism. So that's just a few brief things about Augustine as a Manichee. And you can read, the first several chapters of the Confessions where he talks more about this. He talks about his childhood and moves into, he eventually talks about becoming a Manichee. What did Manichaeism teach? Augustine talks about in his writings against Manichaeism, one of the ways that they pulled people into their teaching was they would ask them, what is the origin of evil? Where does evil come from? And their answer to this, they would provide people, when they're asked questions, put on the spot with questions that someone else has kind of a spiel that they're going to go through, and they start by a question to introduce that spiel. You're often caught off guard, and it may be a question that you haven't thought deeply about before. But they provided a response to this, that there were two principles, one for good and one for evil. And they had a very thorough account of two eternal principles, one good and one evil. And this corresponds to some aspects of Eastern thought, yin and yang and things like that. And Manichaeism came from named Mani from the East, and I'm just doing his dates roughly, 220 to 270, somewhere in there, 220 to 280, somewhere in there. But he, so it stemmed from a teacher named Mani, who was born about 130 years or so before Augustine was born, but it taught that there were two principles, two eternal principles, and that there were these two realms of light and darkness. And again, there was an extensive account of the mythology. But what happened was there's these two realms, and they were completely separated. And then the realm of evil, they understood evil as a material substance, transgressed into the realm of the light. And this began this war between the light and the darkness, between good and evil. And that war is reflected within us, that there are two evil principles at work within us. So you can see how this would give some explanation of evil as having an eternal origin, and it separates evil and good. And they would appeal to texts from Scripture, like what has light to do with darkness. They would appeal to to texts that the separation of the light and the darkness in Genesis, and they would appeal to various texts to be able to account for this. But they saw the two principles as separated from one another until the darkness transgressed over into the light. And again, they use that to account for a war that is within us. And Augustine talks about this in his work on the two souls, the idea that he was working to refute in that work, and he also refutes it on the freedom of the will, is the idea that there are two principles of evil that are at work within us. The problem with it, there are several problems that he noted, but one of the problems was in terms of personal responsibility. If you say that the evil within me, well, that's not really me. There's just I really identify with the light, and the evil within me is something that I can't control. It's just a substance that's warring within me. Then you take no personal responsibility for the evil. You don't identify it with it in any way. So Augustine critiqued this teaching on that grounds. Secondly, he also critiqued it on the grounds, critiqued it to prevent being harmed. Always doing good. He's the source of all good, and no evil can touch him or harm him. So that was part of his response, was if God can't be harmed by evil, if he's immutable, then why would he need to fight? And you might respond, well, he needed to fight to redeem people. The trouble with this is that ultimately in their metaphysics, the Manichees held that there were simply just two substances. And so each of us are either a part of the light. There's within us this part of the light, part of the darkness, and that's really all that there is. So the light within us is actually divinity within us. And so it's not like redeeming something that is not a divine substance. It's all there are. They're not like individual people. There's not an account for individual people. There's just, again, the two substances. This is part of Augustine's critique of some of the mythology of Manichaeism. More importantly is some of the positions that he developed in response to this. One is that evil is not a substance, but instead it is a privation. And I'll motivate this by just thinking about the book of Genesis 1, and asking the question of how could evil be something that's chosen if there was no evil to choose? So, for example, God created the heavens and the earth, and it talks about in Genesis 1 that everything that he made, it was good, and he created Adam and Eve and saw that they were very good. And so all things that come from God, that are created by God, are good. If that's the case, if only good comes from God, and God is the source of things that are distinct from him but created, then how would there be any evil for you to choose? How could you choose something that's not there? Augustine's means of accounting for this was twofold. One, he said that evil consists not in choosing something that is an evil substance, but instead in preferring a lower good above a higher good. So this is something called the gradation of being, or the gradation of goods. God is understood as the highest good above all things, and the source of all good. And created goods are good, but they're not the highest good. And it's possible, and an order in our soul would be that we love the highest good above all things, lower goods less than higher goods, and then again, God above all things. So how is the gradation of order reflected in the created order? Let's just focus on things, created things that are not God. This was recognized by Aristotle. This was recognized by Augustine, by Cicero, I believe, as well, but that there is a gradation within the created order. Augustine recognized this after reading what he referred to as the Platonists. But the idea is that again, within the created order, there's gradated goods. These include things that have existence. These would be things like rocks or metal or carpet or a chair. All of these things are existing things and have the good of existing. That's a good thing to be able to exist. If you look beyond that for something higher, you would find things that not only exist, but they have life. So these would be things like grass and trees and flowers who have the good not just merely of existing, but are animated, have an animating principle, a principle of life, living things, vegetative things. These have the good not just of existence, but life. Beyond this, there are also animals, and animals have not only the good of existence, the good of life, but they have the good of sense and the ability to move, what Aristotle referred to as locomotion. Um, so these include horses and cats and dogs and things like that. And that reflects a higher good than something like a grass or flower. And then higher still is rational animals, what Aristotle and Plato and classical philosophers and Augustine and Aquinas would refer to as rational animals, mankind, us, made in the image of God. So we have the ability to reason. We seek truth, we seek eternal truth, and we seek eternal goodness. And it's in that way that we're made in the divine image. We have an intellect and a will, the ability to reason and to follow the dictates of reason through our conscience. So these are grades of good. This is reflected in, for example, you can imagine a scenario where you're visiting a friend's house and you back out and he's got a rock garden at the edge of his driveway, and you actually disturb the rocks and get into the rock garden. And so you've disturbed the order of the rock garden, but he's not really that upset. If he's got maybe grass or flowers there, it could take the life away from not just the order, not just maybe even crack a rock, but it would take away the life of the flowers or the grass. And that's something where a greater good has been taken, and he's probably more likely to be upset. If his emotions are corresponding to the inherent goodness to each thing, he would be more upset. Now, if instead of backing out, you run over a patch, instead of running over a patch of grass, you run over his dog named Patch, he's going to be even more upset. He loves more the dog, or he should love more the life of the dog who would suffer from that than the patch of grass or the flowers or the rocks. So this reflects his greater sorrow over what's lost, reflects that there's a greater good that's been lost. And you can see, if we go beyond that, and you know, it's never happened to any of us, but you back out and hit someone's son, their grief is going to be immeasurably more than any of the other three things that we mentioned. This reflects that there's gradated goods within the created order, and we shouldn't love Patch the dog, a patch of grass more than Patch the dog, or Patch the dog more than Patch the sun. So you should love higher goods more than lower goods, and God, the source of all good, above all things. So this is a reflection of the gradation of goods, and Augustine accounted for this by by an internal order within the soul, where you love higher things above lower things, and God above all things, who is the source of all good. So that's how he accounted for evil and justice within the soul. The just soul is what he called rightly ordered, where you love God above all things, and your will or your love is subject to reason. Such a person asks not first, do I want this, but instead will first ask, what's the right thing to do here? And will meditate, will think about and be seeking the good and trying to do the right thing. That's reflective of someone that has goodwill, is that you seek what is good, and you ask in competing goods, which is the greater good, which is the thing that I'm supposed to choose here. And in all things, the truly virtuous person loves God above all things, and seeks to order all of their life and all of their other loves toward the service of God, who is the highest good. By contrast, the disordered soul loves lower goods, material goods, above higher goods, immaterial truth and beauty and the divine good that is God himself, who is the source of all good and goodness itself. That's reflective of a disorder. One thing about the Manichees, as Augustine's teaching in the Confessions reflect, is that they seem to be materialists. So Augustine talks about how he couldn't imagine how God could be anything other than matter. He couldn't imagine anything to exist unless it was material. He didn't imagine God in the form of a human body, contrary to the new atheists and their confusion over this. Not even those that were confused and proximately connected to the Christian faith, like Augustine was in his Manichaean days through his mother, Monica, who was a Catholic Christian. They didn't imagine God in the form of a human body. However, Augustine did imagine God as material, and he imagined him either in the world, taking up the world, or extending beyond the world, diffuse throughout space. So that was his account, his account of God as a material being. And then he began, through reading the Platonists, to recognize the existence of immaterial reality. This included the immaterial reality of living things. This term anima, the soul, it was used not just for the human soul, but for the animal. It was understood as a principle of life, and it's this way in Hebrew as well, that a living thing has an animating principle, a thing giving it that life. And that animating principle is the anima, which is Latin for often rendered soul. And so living things were all had a soul. That was, we think of that language soul in terms simply of a human soul. But that's, again, a modern development. Classically, that term was used to refer to as the principle of life of all living things. Now, you might have a rational soul versus what Aristotle called a vegetative soul, for plants, or a sensible soul for animals, or you might have a rational soul. But they were all animating principles that animated the life of the thing that had its own internal principle of movement and growth, the power of nutrition to be able to grow and to be able to move as plants, animals, and people do. So uh, so now I've lost a little bit of track of my thought, but this was the account of the soul. And again, I mentioned earlier, the Manichees had an account of two souls, and Augustine said, no, there's just one soul, an immaterial soul in the person. And it is that person who, through the choice of their will, he wrote an early work on the freedom of the will, is responsible for the evil that they do. And he begins on the freedom of the will, which is a dialogue. It's a Platonic dialogue between him and Evodius. He begins that dialogue with Evodius's words, "Tell me, I ask you, is God not the cause of evil?" And Evodius is taking a Manichaean line of question. He's saying, if you don't recognize that there are two eternal sources of good and evil that are distinct from one another, how are you going to be able to account for the origin of evil if you're saying God is the origin of all things? Doesn't this make him responsible for evil? And Augustine's response is no, that there are human and angelic wills that are responsible for evil. They are the source of evil. These wills can be morally good, but they're not necessarily good. And God is the only one whose will is necessarily good. So Augustine will distinguish their nature, which includes their abilities, their powers to have the will and the intellect, the ability to seek truth and seek what is good. But that will can also be turned toward lower goods, where you love lower goods above higher goods and don't love God above all things. And for us, that's connected to our bodily senses. We're drawn through our senses. We first interact with the world through our senses before our reason develops. We see things and we begin to name things, and we're drawn toward material things initially, but we should, in our development, recognize that there's something deeper underlying that reality, that is the cause of it, the source of it. And this requires a deeper line of questioning. These are things associated with natural theology. Um, but we shouldn't love material goods as though they are the highest good. And the reason for this is because they're commodities and they're temporal, and their ability to satisfy the soul is also temporal. So, what we should be seeking is eternal happiness, eternal satisfaction of the soul, and that only occurs through eternal goods, and goods that are unchangeable, goods that are immutable. So, this is part of Augustine's comprehensive response to Manichaeism. There's not two souls, there's only one soul, and our will, a will that is contingently good and can be turned toward evil. And that's the source of moral evil in the world, is human beings and the evil that's, of angelic beings, that turn to demons, turn to evil. That's the source of moral evil. And then the source of natural evil, he answers in On the Freedom of the Will, is a punishment for moral evil. So those are the responses that he gives. One thing that comes up and On the Freedom of the Will that I'll mention briefly here, and I'm going to cover in another video this afternoon, is he asks the question of whether or not God's foreknowledge can, of our choices, our free choices, whether or not God's foreknowledge means that those choices cannot be otherwise than what they are. Augustine's answer to this has to do with God's relation to time. And his answer is that God stands outside time. He's not bound by time. And so he sees things all in one instant of his eternal being. And so just as we can know the past or know the present and see what people are doing, and it doesn't mean that they don't do those things freely or haven't done them freely in the past, so God can see all things in one instant without it making that choice not be free. He can still know it and it still be free. That's another thing that I'm going to talk about in a video this afternoon, on Luther and Calvin as determinists, and how they break, first with Luther and also with Calvin, how they break from the entire tradition of Christian theology, by saying that all choices are necessary and that freedom of the will is a complete figment of the imagination. So I'll provide some quotes for Luther where he says this sort of thing. By contrast, Augustine affirmed the freedom of the will all throughout his life, both in his early writings on the freedom of the will and up to his late anti-Pelagian writings, including on Grace and Free Will, which was one of his later works, among his latest. So that's a little bit about Augustine and his response to Manichaeism. Just as a brief summary and recap, the Manichees sought to convert people. They're asking the question, where does evil come from? And then they had this very intricate account of good and evil as two substances that were warring against one another, because there were realms of light and darkness, and the darkness transgressed its realm into the light. And Augustine critiques this mythology in several places. He does an analysis of the fundamentum of Mani, and that's where he gets a lot into the actual mythology and analyzes this. And his essential response is that it takes away freedom, and that it also takes away human responsibility, and that also along with that, God, because he's unchangeable, would not need to fight. And so if there's only two substances, good and evil, the good can't be harmed by the evil. So why would it need to fight if God is immutable? And this was a question that he pressed on Fortunatus in Contra Fortunatum. And Fortunatus, he had to press it again and again and again for it to finally click. But Fortunatus wasn't able to answer this because it's not answerable within the Manichaean system. And in response, he said, evil is not a substance. Instead, it's a privation. And so you can understand it. He explains this in one of his early writings, that evil can be understood as a corruption or a decay of something. So, for example, if you take away health, that is an evil. And health is something that's an order, and it results in a decay of the person. A loss of health results in, ultimately can result in death. So that's what evil is a decay or a privation, a loss of some good that should be there. And he would cash this out in the soul in terms of a disorder and a disorder of one's love. So that's a little bit about Augustine on Manichaeism and his response to Manichaeism. I hope that this has been helpful. And you can look for a video this afternoon where I'll be talking about Luther and Calvin as determinist, like the Manichees. Like the Manichees were determinist, Luther and Calvin were determinist. Luther explicitly denied on the freedom of the will, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail this afternoon. I hope to see you there, and may God bless you. Thank you for watching.